Now, Stuart's style. Can you describe his style for me?
Stuart has an absolutely unique presentation style on television, and it's derived from sort of two parts of his character. The first is that he's a natural performer, and the second is he's got an incredibly incisive intellect. And what he decided to do was, to do Media Watch effectively, you had to take the performance element out, so that he would just transfix you, just like that, utterly reptilian, and deliver the lines. And in that way, the content came welling up to the surface, and people would really listen to and take notice of the content, and you took all the showbiz out of it, and that's why it was so effective.
Now, what did you think the role of Media Watch was?
Media Watch is the offshoot of a compact between the public and the media, in that the media can't work effectively unless it enlists the trust of the public. The public have to trust the media to be telling them the truth, or something close to it, for that whole thing to work. Where Media Watch comes into play is when, by either willfully or by incompetence, the media betray that trust, then Media Watch can show that to the public and say, look, these are less than perfect sources, these are less than perfect people, you are being lied to occasionally, you are being persuaded against logic, and that's the real job of Media Watch.
Now, I believe it was important that Media Watch criticised ABC programs as much as other programs outside the ABC. Can you talk about why that was so crucial?
Well, the thing about the media in general is that without the exception of the ABC, they're all commercial. Even the SBS is commercial now. So they have interests. They have proprietorial interests. The ABC doesn't have proprietorial interests, and therefore needs to be even more deeply scrutinised as to its motives and why it does things, and when it stuffs up. I mean, it's very important to show ABC people who are mainly loyalists, ABC viewers, that their service is also less than perfect. But there was no particular brief to go harder after the ABC. The ABC was just part of the media. If we were cross-examining, let's say, the way the media as a whole had treated one story, we'd include the ABC.
Now, I believe that made you very unpopular with ABC management.
Well, it's an interesting thing, isn't it? We were sort of the baby that they created that turned around and bit them on the bum, really. Yes, we were something of an embarrassment to the ABC because the ABC is used to being beyond reproach, you know, sort of Caesar's wife. And we kept showing that they were at least as imperfect as everyone else. There was a lot of pressure occasionally, very subtly expressed. No one came round with a sledgehammer and tried to hit us on the head, but there was the odd phone call from the managing director, the odd phone call once from the chairman, and plenty of sort of undercurrent attempts. We certainly made, not of our own doing, but I don't think, but we certainly made a big enemy of news and current affairs. They did not like us at all. They felt that we were unfairly attacking them for things that were quite defensible practices, or that we were picking on them.
In one Media Watch episode, Littlemore criticises, among others, ABC newsreader for faking up interviews in Russia. Can you recall what happened there?
Well, what we did was just expose what had become an incredibly common practice in television, and not just the ABC, but it just so happened that we had a very good example in the ABC, and that is that you have a foreign correspondent, or you send someone on location for a big story, and all the news programs wanted to give the impression that they were able to do live crosses to their man on the spot. Well, the point is, not everyone can cross live at the same time. Usually it's the wrong time of day, it's pitch dark or whatever. The practice is that, or practice was, that these people would pre-record responses with a tip-in line that said, oh, well, yes, thanks, Peter, or thanks, Sean, or whatever, and they just chopped them in, and everyone would pretend. It became a kind of thespian exercise to pretend that you were doing this live on-the-spot stuff. Now, it's quite unnecessary perversion of a perfectly ordinary medium, which is television, and you say, well, we have a reporter, and here's his report. But no, they had to trick it all up and make it into showbiz. And all we did was just explain it. That's one of the things that Media Watch, I think, does very well, and that is expose the tradecraft of television and to a lesser extent newspapers and just show viewers, this is how it's done. This is how you're being fooled.
Do you mind just talking in very general and brief terms about some of the sorts of unethical practices? You looked at plagiarism, checkbook journalism, faking locations, so just in big sweeping terms.
Well, it's the old betrayal of trust thing. The job of Media Watch is to show the ethical lapses that are most common in the media, and how to spot them, how to expose them, and hopefully please don't do it again. I mean, the most obvious is plagiarism. Plagiarism is theft. We'd have journalists ring us up saying, oh, that was a bit unfair, you know, it was a very tight news day, etc. And we say, well, if someone comes around to your place and steals your television, that's theft. It's the same. You've stolen someone else's words. That's pretty easy to prove plagiarism. Conflict of interest is more difficult, although to my mind, an undeclared interest in journalism is one of the worst sins, in that the public is trusting that this copy or the piece to camera or the narration in television is the truth and isn't biased by interests that haven't been declared. But where there's a commercial interest or a friendship or a legal problem or anything else you'd care to think of, not to declare that really betrays trust with the viewer or the reader.
Can you talk about how, for the first time, Media Watch really made journalists publicly accountable?
One of the interesting things to us as the program developed and we began to realise that we actually had some teeth, people were taking notice of us, and we had terrific viewer support, was how utterly useless the so-called self-regulation system of journalism has been. That the journalist's own code of ethics was very rarely enforced. It was honoured more in the breach than the observers. And the Press Council, who were supposed to self-regulate newspapers, were utterly worthless and utterly unable to do anything about breaches, anything substantial about breaches. So, in a way, Media Watch became a kind of de facto court for this sort of thing.
Can you talk about, I mean, there's I don't know if this is your view, but there is a view that during your time at Media Watch, it was a particularly aggressive time for journalists using foot-in-the-door tactics.
I think, particularly in television, the characteristic styles of the mid-90s were sensationalism, sheer sensationalism, driven usually by prejudice, and intrusions, what people call foot-in-the-door journalism. The difference is that, of course, a newspaper reporter can do foot-in-the-door and there are no witnesses. On television, the camera's rolling. So the performance of actually confronting people became the guts of the story. In the producers was going, oh gee, I hope there's a bit of stoush, I hope there's a bit of argy-bargy and shouting and hand in the camera and all that sort of stuff. It became a genre in itself. It's totally pointless. It doesn't add to the public's understanding of the story one iota. In fact, it's a trick to demonise the person that you are trying to talk to. If you are aggressive towards them and confront them and try and get that kind of reaction, you are saying, unspoken message, this person is a shonk. And that was the style of House for very many years. The second, I mean, to me perhaps more distressing was this incredible depth of prejudice-driven journalism that, you know, current affairs, particularly in the mid-90s, was racist, was against the unemployed, the downtrodden in many ways. They were turned into kind of objects of derision and hatred. And that was a reflection, dare I say, of what was happening in talkback radio. That there was an incredible amount of hate radio going on, and that rolled into television and became easy fodder for the news and current affairs programs.
Now, Media Watch gets its stories from a number of sources. Can you talk about how they get the stories?
Media Watch stories do not fall out of the sky. I've always tried to explain to people, to say, where did you get all that material? How did you know that? That most of it is pick and shovel research. That if you've got a good research team, they will find a lot of this stuff simply by being suspicious, looking at one story against another, saying, hang on, what happened here? This isn't right. But also, enormous amount came from the outside, from tips.
Now, one story that you did get a tip off on, I believe, is Barcelona Tonight.
Yeah.
Can you explain to me what Barcelona Tonight was and how you did get that story?
This was a classic Media Watch gotcha, and it came from a tip. In fact, I'm still not allowed to say who, but I can say it was a Sydney barrister who happened to be in Spain at the time, and the chase for Skase was very big. You know, Christopher Skase, who had left the country, leaving behind millions of dollars of debt after an unsuccessful ownership of the Seven Network, amongst other things. Anyway, Skase was in Mallorca and wouldn't be interviewed, cooperate with the media at all. Channel 7, Today Tonight, had a certain interest in trying to chase down Skase. Anyway, they sensationalised the story. They went there and claimed that they'd been hounded off the island by police or heavies acting on behalf of Skase. Now, it turned out that was complete fabrication. Nothing like that had happened. They had mocked it up, they'd filmed themselves driving at night in cars, looking furtive, carried on a trek. Now, the giveaway was a tiny detail in the background of one shot, which was a hoarding on a cinema. They were claiming they were racing through the night in Mallorca to get away from Skase's heavies. In fact, that shot was shot on a street in Barcelona. Our informant just happened to notice it. We took it from that tip, put it all together, assembled, got sources to say which films were showing on which cinemas in Barcelona on that day. We put it all together and did it as an exposé. Fantastic story. The thing about it is, though, something that's always annoyed me about that story, our story was absolutely watertight. The producer and the reporter had utterly fabricated a story and passed it off as the truth. Now, if they'd been given evidence in a court, that'd be perjury and they could go to jail for it. What happened to them? They got suspended on pay for a month and all went back and had their own jobs. It's absolutely appalling. You've got to take Stuart with a grain of salt. He likes to be provocative. He was a journalist himself, so he knows of which he speaks. On the other hand, how else are we going to know about the world other than through the media? We have to trust journalists to some extent. I think what he's saying is that a significant proportion of journalists have questionable ethics and questionable work practices, and I think I have to agree to some extent. I mean, I'm still a working journalist, so I can't say, oh no, we're all scoundrels and rogues. There are some terrific journalists around, but the point is this: if it is easy to fill a program such as Media Watch every week, and it always was very easy to fill it with strong material, then there's something rotten in the state of Denmark. And it gets depressing after a while, and I can understand why Stuart in the end would say, well, you know, I have contempt for them.
Now, did Media Watch ever apologise or make a correction if something went wrong?
It's a myth that Media Watch never apologised, never corrected, never clarified. It's a complete myth. Luckily, during the period I was at the helm, our errors were very, very few and very, very minor. If it was a demonstrable error of fact, it would be corrected and apologised for in the very next program. I mean, sometimes an error of fact doesn't require an apology, it just requires acknowledgement. The myth is that we never apologise for things that we got wrong. Usually what journalists are actually saying when they complain about that is that they disagreed with our opinion. Never forget, Media Watch is essentially a program of commentary and opinion. It isn't straight didactic documentary television. So if the host or the program has a firm opinion about something and they express it, it may not accord with what the journalist thinks of their own work, and that may well be so. But an opinion can't be wrong. An opinion is just an opinion. So you can't correct or apologise for an opinion.
Now, look, just getting on to an old journo that was good Media Watch fodder, Darren Hinch. I've looked at some of the footage, and there's a classic where Media Watch had a whole montage of his studio intros and back announcers where he puts his own personal experiences in almost every story, and Media Watch accused him of being self-obsessed. Why was it important to show that?
I mean, Darren isn't a terribly significant journalist. He's quite a seasoned performer and he's been a good tabloid editor in his time. but he's essentially his own creation. And, he sustained what you might call a career by going sort of from staggering from crisis to crisis and making himself the centre of a story. You're doing it to bring attention to yourself. So we were simply saying, look at this man, look at what he passes off as journalism. It's actually self-obsession. He's not alone in that, by the way, but he's a particular case. And in a way, because he trades on his kind of crusading zeal and his fearlessness, it was a useful thing to say, look, actually what he's doing is just talking about himself.
Now, in fact, he says that he was an easy target because he looked different. He was a bit of a groundbreaker, he had a beard, he didn't wear a tie, he had a different approach to journalism.
It's very hard to take Darren seriously when he says that the reason that we were interested in his performance is because he had a beard.
Look, the other thing that Hinch says is that he was never approached for his side of the story from Media Watch.
There's a recurring bleat from my colleagues in the media that in Media Watch, at least during our time there, Stuart and myself, they were never offered the right of reply. Absolutely true. So what? It's not a debate. It's not a Four Corners program where you've got to have the for and against. It's a program of opinion, commentary and review. And what's the right of reply to plagiarism? What's the right of reply to failing to disclose a personal interest? There is none. We just got on with it, told the story, thank you and good night.
Now, just moving on, there was a very comical piece of television that you showed with Mike Willesee drunk on camera, and I also believe you showed the ABC's Philip Williams drunk on camera. What's the point of doing that?
What's the point of showing somebody drunk still going on television and presenting to the Australian public? What would be the point of saying someone driving a train was drunk? What would be the point of showing somebody sitting on the High Court bench drunk? It's the same point. You're paid to do a job, the public expects you to perform it in a professional manner. If you don't, then you're worthy of exposure. The media would be the first to leap on someone else doing it, so why shouldn't we show them doing it?
Now, can you talk about how Media Watch under Stuart Littlemore did raise questions about radio announcers getting paid for advertising long before the Cash for Comment story broke?
When Media Watch finally exposed the Cash for Comment story in a big way with documents and statements and all of that, it was a fantastic story. But in fact, that story had been told 2 or 3 years before. We did a story that we called Optus and the Parrot, which was about how Alan Jones was clearly taking money to favour Optus over Telstra at the time when everyone was changing over to new phone networks and they had to have a new prefix and the introduction of Optus as a competitor. Now, we devoted the whole program to it, 13-minute essay basically, an illustrated essay, and we had extracts from him, Jones on radio and supporting information that proved that he was taking money to plug Optus. The interesting thing is that we were very pleased with that story. We thought, wow, we've really nailed this one. The rest of the media didn't understand it. They did not get it. And it took a much blunter instrument, which was leaked documents from the Bankers Association, I think it was, to prove that Laws and Jones and various others were taking money and doing Cash for Comment. But it's one of those interesting things of media history that the story had been told years before, just nobody got it.
Now look to one story that's one of my favourites, the Paxton family.
Yeah.
Can you tell me who the Paxton family were and what sort of treatment they had at the hands of the Current Affair?
This was a very interesting example of victim television, that a Current Affair decided that they would make a scandal out of the fact that there was a family out of suburban Melbourne with teenage kids who didn't really want to go out and work, who would rather get the dole. In fact, only one of them qualified for the dole, the others were too young, I think. And they really played it up. I think they paid them a small amount of money or gave them favours to play their own roles in this thing. but it snowballed and became an absolute witch hunt. All the Media Watch did was deconstruct it in the classical sense. We said, okay, here's the stories, here's what they said, here's the truth of the matter. The fact is, a current affair is trying to turn these people into ratings fodder by feeding your prejudice against the unemployed, the dole bludger. It was classic prejudice-based journalism. And all we did was show what had happened. The interesting thing is, often, if you just lay out the facts of the situation, they came on this day, they shot this, they did that interview, they paid them this, then they did that, then they interviewed this person, and here's the terrible introductions and back announcers that they did to feed your prejudice, that's all you have to do. You don't actually have to make your own point, you just put the evidence there.
Now, the reporter Mike Munro is on the record talking about the Paxtons. Talking about the Paxtons.
Yeah, go on. Ask a question.
And he says, as long as he knows in his heart that what he did was fair and accurate, he can sleep beautifully. What's your response to that?
I have no doubt at all that Mike Munro believes that he has nothing to answer for, but I think the broader public know that that kind of journalism is beneath contempt. Mike comes from the crime pages of tabloid Sydney newspapers, and many of us graduated from less noble sources than that. But look, if he's lost so much perspective that he doesn't understand that the Paxtons was a particularly nasty piece of television, then you have to worry about his judgment.
Can you talk about the Illawarra Mercury and how it was constantly featured on Media Watch?
It's important to understand that Media Watch is a program, it's a show, so it has to be entertaining. That's why, at least in our time, we did a lot of silly misprints and funny bits of ignorance from journalists, just to show that we're all human and it's an amusing life, a cavalcade as it goes past. The Illawarra Mercury was something of a running gag for us. Just when we thought they couldn't do anything sillier, they'd do something very, very silly. The fact is that we had quite a good relationship with them. I used to exchange Christmas cards with the editor. But I think Stuart hit it on the head when he said that it's Australia's last great ratbag newspaper. I mean, it was a genuine paper of ratbaggery. The interesting thing is, it's a damn good paper now. If you pick up the Mercury, it really serves its local readership well.
People like Darren Hinch said attacking the Illawarra Mercury, it was like shooting fish in a bucket, it was too easy. Other critics have said, look, the petty spelling mistakes and grammar.
Well, there are two things there. Look, as far as the Mercury is concerned, it's easy to forget that that was the only newspaper for that region, and it's a highly populous and important region. You've got Wollongong, Port Kembla, Kiama, all around there. Very influential newspaper. The primary source. Every tradesman had it stuck in his back pocket, every bus driver had it in the dashboard. So it's always important to treat those newspapers with respect and to understand that they have an area of influence. So it's not illegitimate to criticise them if they're sloppy. We do it for any newspaper. As far as the criticisms of us being trivial about misprints and things like that is concerned, don't forget, words are the trade. Words are what journalism is all about. They are our chisels and screwdrivers. Now, if we use them incorrectly, or stupidly, or ignorantly, then that's worthy of exposure. If you book an electrician to come and change a light bulb and he pulls out a screwdriver, you know he's not much of an electrician. It's the same thing. I mean, the fact that they're funny is useful in an entertainment sense. It breaks up the serious items, but it also shows that standards are poor, that people don't really understand the tools of their own trade.
Now, another Media Watch program which I just found incredible was the Channel 9 news reporter Steve Barrett. He goes into a grieving widow's house and gives the impression that he's a policeman so he can get photographs of her dead husband. Can you talk about that incident and what it represents?
One of the most valuable things I think Media Watch does is expose tradecraft, to say this is how the media got that story. Now, it's very rare that you get your hands on chapter and verse, but in this case we did. And we had footage of, it's a very common scene, when there's a shocking death of some kind, the media will descend by instinct bang, they'll be there, and they'll work out what they do next. But first they get there. And if they can get in the door, even better. Now in this case, the widow of the man who'd been shot had no English. So she had no defences. She couldn't stop. So she ended up with a front room full of media people, television crews. It was an impossible situation. Now, to his or her everlasting credit, somebody from some network kept their camera rolling in their lap, just pointing up, and got this extraordinary moment of one of the reporters, Steve Barrett, apparently giving the impression that the photos, I think the exact line is, the photos are needed for police identification purposes.
Now, look, in a 1 hour special on Media Watch, what do you think is important to see? What do you want to see?
Oh, in the program?
Yeah. What's the message?
Well, let me say, anyone who's worked for me knows that I'm against all anniversary programs. I hate them with a passion. I think they just draw attention to programs for no good reason. So what, you've done 20 years, so what, you've done 1,000 episodes. But I can't stop them. If we're going to have this program, I hope it just uses the same standards as Media Watch would use on the rest of the media, on itself. I think if it sees imperfections and mistakes, it should make them clear.